Lesson 24, Limitations of Low Light. When there's not much light, this affects our ability to see and our ability to take pictures. It's important to understand how light levels affect how your camera records an image. When the light is low, there's very often low contrast or very high contrast. This can make it difficult to see clearly and to record well-exposed images. This is because we see reflected light and our cameras record reflected light. And so when there's not much light reflecting off a subject, it makes it more difficult to take a photograph of it. Every day the sun doesn't provide much light until about half an hour before sunrise until about half an hour after sunset. And at night, without the help of artificial light, it's difficult to see much or for our cameras to record a well-exposed image. And taking photos inside or anywhere else that it's quite dark can pose the same type of problems for our cameras as it can when we're trying to take photos at night. And because of the low contrast caused by low light, our camera's autofocus systems will not often function so well either. And it's going to be more difficult to manually focus your lens in low light because it's just difficult to see what you're focusing on. Using higher ISO settings can help you get better photos in low light. As you learned in the previous lesson, using a higher ISO makes your camera sensor more responsive to light so that you can take photos in darker places. The lens you have on your camera also has an effect on how you can manage to take photos when there's not much light. The widest aperture setting on some lenses allows for much more light to enter the lens than on others. On most kit lenses, the widest aperture setting will be around f3.5 or f4 when it's at the widest zoom range. On some other lenses, higher quality lenses, you might get an aperture setting, the widest one, of say f2.8, or on prime lenses, lenses that don't zoom, you can even get settings of f1.4 or 1.2 or even wider on very expensive lenses. My favourite lens is a 35mm f1.4 lens, which lets in about 8 times as much light as this lens does, which only has a maximum aperture of f4. And of course, you can always adjust your shutter speed setting as well to a slower speed, but this is not always practical if you don't have a tripod or when your subject is moving quickly. So a slower shutter speed is not always the best solution. Often choosing a higher ISO will be a better option. So when you are taking photos in low light situations, don't be scared of using a higher ISO setting. One other thing that you can do is learn to reduce the noise using image editing software. You can quite often reduce the amount of digital noise that appears in an image if you've used a very high ISO, but you do need to be careful and not to be too aggressive with noise reduction enhancements because these can tend to soften an image and make it look less sharp than it is. Whatever camera gear you use and whatever settings you choose, there's always more challenges involved in taking photos in low light situations. But the more you understand your camera and the controls for exposure, the better photos you'll be able to take. Lesson 24, Practical Exercise, Limitations of Low Light. This exercise will help you get a better idea of what it's like to take photos in low light and how you can manage your settings better. You'll need to choose to take these photos at night or somewhere like a darkened room. Find an interesting subject to photograph, and with your camera set to program mode, adjust your ISO settings so that it's at 400. And as you're working on this exercise, pay attention to how well your camera's autofocus is working. In low light settings, sometimes autofocus won't function quite so well. And each time you take a photo, take note of what your aperture and your shutter speed settings are. You'll need to set your camera on a tripod or a firm surface because your shutter speeds will be quite slow. For the first set of photos, make sure that your background is evenly lit or dark, but make sure that there is no bright lights included in your composition. And take a series of interesting pictures. Then take some other photos where there is a bright light in the background. So either position yourself so you can see part of a window or a light, or put a table lamp or a flashlight into the composition so that it's shining pretty much directly into your camera lens, and take another series of photos. Make sure to be making a note of what your aperture and shutter speed settings are. Compare the different photos that you've taken and look at the information, look at the data that you've recorded about your camera settings. What are the differences that you can notice when a bright light was included in your composition behind your subject? And how was your camera's autofocus functioning? And if you're not sure about the results that you're seeing from the photos in this exercise or any of the others in this course, please do ask questions. The main points in this lesson are: photographing in low light challenges your camera and your eyes. Using a high ISO setting will help your exposures in low light. Your camera may not autofocus so well in low light settings. Practice this to improve your photography. Even when you think there's not enough light to take a photo, challenge yourself to find the balance of your exposure settings and take some photos anyway.